Many thousands of women in Canada, the US and the UK have XY chromosomes. That is the label male chromosomes. For some, this is the dark secret, to use the series title of a BBC documentary. For many others, it is something that they do not even know about. Androgen insensitivity syndrome, or AIS, is one of the many intersex conditions, or disorders of sexual development, as the terminology now tends to be, though it's still a contested terminology. With AIS, a fetus with XY chromosomes does not respond to the androgens that are necessary for virilization, and so continues to develop a female body type with female external genitalia. Such XY women usually have internal testes and no uterus, but externally, the only signs of the condition are a lack of pubic hair and underarm hair and the absence of periods. It is likely that more than 1 in every 20,000 male, i.e. XY births, are affected. One study has put it as high as 1 in 2,000, and I'll leave you to work out the math as to how many thousands that will be in Canada, the US and UK. However, it's quite probable that many women with XY chromosomes are never diagnosed. And of those women who have been diagnosed, many never know because they are never told. With the best interests of the patient in mind, it has been a common practice for doctors not to disclose the true nature of the condition, in the general belief that the psychological shock would be too great for the patient to bear. Indeed, a prize-winning article in the Journal of the Canadian Medical Association advocated just such an approach. Consequently, women with AIS have faced a long history of lies, secrecy, and half-truths. And when parents are told, they too get drawn into the conspiracy of silence. The result is a web of lies from parents and doctors, the very people we are expected to trust most. Moreover, the usual course of management for the condition is to remove the testes and to put the AIS patient on lifelong hormone replacement therapy. Without full disclosure, it is at least a matter of debate as to whether agreement to such treatment constitutes informed consent. The testes, for instance, are often described as twisted ovaries, and their removal is explained as a hysterectomy. The same might also be said of the other medical procedures that AIS women have experienced. Exhibited in front of doctors, subjected to medical photography, and having blood and tissue, and often it's labial tissue, samples taken for research. Knowledge that there is a secret is knowledge enough. And AIS patients are as able as anyone to pick up on the telltale clues of hushed conversations and embarrassed looks. It is highly likely that this policy of secrecy has caused more damage than the condition itself. As one woman said, "I have experienced more emotional pain about the fact that my family didn't tell me the truth than about either my gonads or my chromosomes." One patient figured out there was something wrong when she was in hospital and was examined by over 100 doctors and interns. Another woman only found out from her mortgage company, which had queried her medical records as part of the application process for a loan. Clearly, the circumstances of XY women raise major questions about trust. In 1998, the General Medical Council in the UK issued guidelines which require all doctors to be open and frank with their patients. For women with AIS, the guidelines may mean the truth at last, but it is doubtful that it will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And although the GMC's guidelines may now promote openness, many doctors will find it difficult to volunteer information as a first step and the long and difficult process of secrecy reversal. I mean, just how do you tell someone that you have betrayed their trust for several years? With the prospect of possible disciplinary action for not being frank and open, burying secrets even deeper may be seen as an attractive, easy option. Each new diagnosis is an opportunity for a new honesty, but there will be countless women and children already diagnosed who will continue to labour under the weight of a fearful ignorance. With no or very little information coming from doctors or parents, AIS patients are forced to rely on the haphazard process of self-diagnosis, increasingly through internet searches, and I'll come back to that in just a moment. Yet in those cases where the patient has been told or has found out the diagnosis, she often comes to know more about the condition than the doctor. Moreover, what is known, and more importantly, how it is known, results in a major disjunctions in the perspectives of doctor and patient. So if you take a look at this grid that I put together, we can see that for the doctor, the problem is one of virilization, the lack of response to androgens. For the patient, the problem is not being fully female, though the process of virilization doesn't happen, the process of feminization also doesn't happen. There's still the presence of malaria duct inhibitory factor, which prevents that sort of development. The doctor looks at faulty gene as a cause, the patient looks at the presence of this inhibiting factor as the cause, and most importantly, as you work the way down, the end result for doctor is one of secrecy, and the policy of the patient is actually disclosure. It's the fourth line down, the experience of AIS, that is the one that I'm going to focus on mostly. Where doctors see a failure to virilize and trace the problem back to a faulty gene, XY women experience a failure to fully feminize and trace the problem back to the presence of an unwanted hormone which inhibits the development of uterus and tubes. Language makes the problem worse. Why should bits of biochemistry, such as chromosomes and hormones, be labelled as male? Doctors see the male label and worry about gender identity, but XY women experience a female body and worry about infertility and sexual inadequacy. And there's the major difference. For doctors, AIS is a condition being known about only vicariously via their own or other patients. But for XY women, it is a lived experience. Moreover, by acknowledging such experiential expertise and bringing it to complement the technical expertise of the medical profession, we can reframe the dialogue between expert and lay knowledges. This in turn enables us to reconsider the idea of expertise and the trust that is placed in it. And it's that I want to look at today. My starting point are the models of science communication which Bruce Lewinstein touched on yesterday, and recent calls for dialogue between experts and lay people. And I do so not simply because the care regime for XY women would certainly benefit from more open dialogue, but also because I believe that how we think about trust can benefit from the work that has been done on how we think about the communication of science. And as Bruce pointed out yesterday, the usual dominant or common sense view of science communication, this unidirectional linear model, send a message receiver, here's the expert, there's the public, fill up these empty vessels with as many right answers as possible, has now been not quite replaced, certainly not replaced, but certainly questioned by people working in science studies, media studies, cultural studies, and so on. And I say it's not been replaced because it's still commonly found, not least as we've discovered yesterday with Jim Hammonds' comment about, in his response to the question about, isn't that just an old model of communication that you're working with? And Jim said, well, actually I don't know about models of communication, but my experience tells me this is how the system works. And it's interesting that in that answer, he himself was drawing on his own experiential expertise, his own lived experience. So it's all very nice and well saying, let's question these models and look at science communication, but let's also look at our own practices and our own lived experiences as well. And as Bruce touched on yesterday, there's a number of alternative models from communication studies, media studies. We might refer to Stuart Hall's circuit of communication. Bruce yesterday was talking about a web of science communication, or more likely sort of three-dimensional sphere of communication. But what all these models have in common is that they include the public as part of that. The public is part of this sphere, this web of communication. However, even if the public does have a part to play, one can still ask what that part's expected to be. The new language of dialogue is now accompanied by demands not so much for the public understanding of science as for the public engagement with science. But engagement with what and on whose terms? As Willsden and Willis have pointed out, debates over science and technology can actually be closed down because they are too often dominated by questions of risk assessment, asking simply whether a technology is safe rather than whether it is necessary. More fundamental questions are at stake in any new technology, they say, like who owns it, who benefits from it, to what ends will it be directed? In other words, just the sorts of questions that the public is likely to ask. Not surprisingly, they see that scientists are faced with a crisis of trust because the public can see only too well the blurring of boundaries between science, business, and politics. Now, one of the weaknesses of the dominant and common sense model, I believe, is that it doesn't look at the relationship between the two sides of the communication process. Not that there's actually two sides, because it's a web circuit, so on, but certainly you need to look at the relationship, not just the transfer of information from one person to another. And there's a danger, I believe, that the same could happen with the new emphasis on dialogue. That the new emphasis on dialogue, even though it might say, it's two-way, doesn't actually look at the relationship between the two sides. Both sides might now be given a voice, but this equality may just mask the real inequality of power that exists. It is still the scientific advisor that has better access to government circles and the media. It is still the doctor that asks the patient to remove their clothes, not vice versa. I mean, try that next time you have a cough and see your GP. Furthermore, this asymmetry of power is accompanied by a more subtle inequality. Science is presented as having the facts, and the public has opinions about the facts. And if we are to address this asymmetry, we need to acknowledge that there is knowledge and opinion on both sides. This is not just a recognition that scientists are the public too, and so are equally entitled to have opinions, but an acknowledgement that within the practice of science, different positions will be taken by different scientists. This might even be said to be an essential feature of scientific practice, and much is made that scientific knowledge is based on consensus, but the process of science is driven by dissent, rejecting old paradigms, falsifying theories, or simply trying to make a name for oneself. It's especially important to remember this in the context of science in public, firstly because scientific controversy brings scientific opinion into the public domain, secondly because it's not uncommon for scientists to make a direct appeal to the public as a way of trying to resolve or win controversies within science. And finally, it's because it's where knowledge is still undecided and science, as it were, is still under construction, that there is likely to be most public interest. Furthermore, if we are to recognise that scientists have opinions, then we would also recognise that the public has knowledge. But in so doing, we need to be aware that this raises fundamental issues about the nature of expertise. Collins and Evans put the matter quite bluntly. It is no longer clear that scientists and if it is no longer clear that scientists and technologists have special access to truth, why should their advice be especially valued? Why, in other words, should they be trusted? What they propose is that the distinction between expert and non-expert be re-established, but crucially, the distinction would be based on expertise, not on whether an expert is professionally accredited with the necessary qualifications and certificates. In this way, non-certified experts would be experience-based experts. And as examples, they cite Brian Wynn's study of Cumbrian sheep farmers, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, arguing with government officials over the fallout from Chernobyl and the influence of AIDS activists on medical research. We might now also add the experiential expertise of XY women. As our models of science communication become ever more sophisticated, so too should our models of trust. It is clear that science communication is not simply a form of almsgiving, as Buttigieg has described it. Similarly, trust is not simply something that is bought with reliable information. Too often I think it's presented as something, here's the scientist, here's the reliable information, you give me your trust, and it's like, you buy it off me, it's just an exchange. True dialogue would give the public the freedom to set its own agenda, frame its own questions, make its own decisions, moving debates upstream, as Jen was talking about just now. Being informed is not enough. The public also needs to be empowered. When he was news editor at Nature, David Dixon argued that calls for dialogue did not go far enough. He suggested that the public is well aware of the political dimensions to science. Indeed, it is that which causes such distrust, and not the activities of scientists themselves. During the BSE crisis of the early 90s, for example, it is easy to see the British public distrusting government science advisors because they lied about the safety of eating beef. But, says Dixon, and I quote, what is frequently ignored is the public's correct perception that the lies originated in the influence of the beef industry over the Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Fisheries. Similarly, the critical attitude to GM foods is not mistrust of science, but mistrust of multinationals and globalization. I'll give you a quote from Dixon again now. Without additional attention to the political factors, says Dixon, influencing, indeed frequently determining the way science is used in society, there is unlikely to be a resolution of the tensions created by the distrust that originates from the exclusion of individuals from decision-making. So if we are to revise our models of science communication to take into account the relationship between science and the public, then so too we need to think of trust in similar terms. We should think of trust as something that is engendered by and embodied in a relationship. And this may be even more true for trust than it is for communication. We need to think not just in terms of the web or circuit or sphere of communication, but also in terms of the web or circuit or sphere of trust that goes with it. Now, I started earlier by saying about my own expertise, and I said I'm not the expert and I don't have the answers. Now, my own expertise, as I said, is in popular science, and my approach to a popular science is to look at science communication not simply as this transfer of information, but also, and most importantly, in terms of the construction of meanings. What gets contested are different meanings about the information that's given. And what seems to be happening with the XY women is that they have created their own meanings through their own lived experiences and have now started to challenge the medical profession. So rather than an old model of transfer of information and people construct meanings around that information, what seems to be happening with XY women is that they have their own meanings from their lived experience, and from those meanings they're now challenging the information of the certified, qualified medical profession, the doctors, and the policies that they're proposing. XY women are far from being fully empowered, as Dixon was arguing the public should be. But they have begun to find their voice. In 1993, the Androgen Insensitivity Syndrome Support Group was formally established in the UK, and by 1995 was publishing a regular newsletter and holding meetings twice a year. The US branch of the group held its first meeting in 1996, the same year that a Toronto-based group was set up, and a joint US-Canadian meeting was held in Toronto in 2003. There are now also groups in Australia and Spain, and many other countries where there aren't actually particular groups, but there's a point of contact. There's at least a name and address for people to get in touch with. This consortium of groups provides information and support not only for individuals and families affected by AIS, but also for a range of other XY female conditions, such as 5-alpha reductase deficiency and others. It now maintains a large and very informative website. Now, if I can do this properly, oops. What's going on here now? What I need to do is... Right. Yeah, can I, how do I make that bigger? That one, is it? Not used to this one. Full screen?
Full screen. This will do.
Okay. Right, okay, thanks, Ed. Yes, as I said, I'm not the expert. I'm certainly not the expert on working. This is the website for the group. You can see the addresses: US, Canadian, Spanish group, and so on. And what's interesting is when you start going through some of the links down the left-hand side, it gives. Explains all about complete androgen insensitivity syndrome. Oops. There are, it's put together a patient's charter, draft charter in the UK. It's got lots of literature that it's put together, a fact sheet. Okay. It's got a fact sheet which doesn't show pretty well there, but it's quite important, this fact sheet, because it's this information that doctors are now sending their own patients to. The AIS support group has now become one of the main areas of expertise for doctors, because the doctors don't know about it, so they are sent to the AIS website. So this hasn't only helped patients through the process of self-diagnosis, but it's also become a valuable resource for members of the medical profession. Whenever possible, the address for the site is now given as a follow-up link in discussions about intersex, as, for example, happened with the Oprah Winfrey show just a few weeks ago, a discussion sparked by the show's book club, which had been reading Middlesex by Jeffrey Eugenides. As a result, the group has done much to persuade the medical profession that it is disclosure and not secrecy that is in the patient's best interests. More significantly, the group has helped the medical profession, or at least parts of it, to rethink its approach to the management of intersex conditions. Writing in the British Medical Journal, consultant gynaecologist Sarah Crichton and gynaecological research fellow Catherine Minto argued that the policy of non-disclosure had to be abandoned and that intersex patients should be managed within a multidisciplinary team, both of which are key aims of the support groups. Long-term follow-up studies were crucial, they said, but, and I quote, such studies can be done only with the equal involvement of people with these conditions and of peer support groups and the cooperation of all clinicians managing intersex. It is time to create a major intersex research partnership to begin tackling these questions and move forwards towards enlightened and patient-empowered care. In other words, the successful management of AIS is dependent on teamwork, and the patient should be part of that team. For collaboration to be effective, each side needs to trust the other. For there to be true, open dialogue, the experiential expertise of the patient is needed to complement the technical expertise of the certified expert. The public can be experts too, and if we expand this notion of expertise, then so too we should expand the domain of those who should be trusted. Thank you.